I think has one of the worst APIs.
Does great developer experience still mean the same thing to you today?
If that SDK has a method that doesn't explain the parameters, like I'm going to be mad at you.
Is that what you would suggest to people building a backend from scratch today?
If I were to do it again, I would 100% start with.
Has your point of view changed on that over the last few years?
If I had a gun to my head that said like, pick a tool to integrate with, I'm going to pick like.
Hi everyone, this is Sagar, CEO of Speakeasy. On today's second ever episode of Request Response, we had Robert Ross, CEO of FireHydrant. We chatted about his journey to building FireHydrant, his experience building with gRPC, and why flying on airplanes is important to finding great developer experience. Lastly, will LLMs make API design easier than it is today, or will it make our lives more complicated? Join us to learn more. Hey everyone, I'm your host, Sagar Batchu, CEO and co-founder of Speakeasy. I'm joined today by Robert Ross, CEO and co-founder of FireHydrant. Robert, it's great to have you here today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Just to help our audience here, I'd love to learn a little bit more about what FireHydrant does, your role there today, and just how you got to this place.
Yeah, so FireHydrant is the end-to-end incident management platform. We've been around about 6 years now, just over 6 years. And my background is I've been building software for a long time, was an on-call engineer for a number of years. And sometimes I was putting out the fires, sometimes I was the arsonist. And what led to the creation of FireHydrant was you would get paged and it was kind of a now what moment. There was a lot of automation that was missing from my tool chain. So started going to a Starbucks early in the morning here in New York City, built the first kind of iterations of FireHydrant, and a few months later, accidentally started a company. So here we are today.
I mean, I can definitely relate. I haven't spent that many years as an on-call engineer, but those that I did, a lot of chaos every time something happens. Something goes wrong, and then suddenly you're like, what do I do? Who do I contact? How do I coordinate the situation? So, no, it's super cool. I've checked out your product, and I wish I had it many years ago at different companies. I'd love to talk a little bit about the role APIs play for FireHydrant today. Maybe just to kick it off, do you guys have a public API, and is it important to your business model at all?
Oh, yeah. So actually, when the company first started, I had just been, this was like, I don't know, 2017, even 2016. My last job was to build the core services of our application. And the way I approached it is I was using gRPC. We have gRPC gateways in front of everything. And what we started doing is we started moving the backend Rails application to a lot of that logic to an API, and then making the front end React at that point in time, basically making API calls to that internal API. And I saw the benefits of it, but I also saw how painful it was to move to that pattern, given I was doing it. So when FireHydrant started, I actually said from day one, that's going to be the architecture. Is that there's not going to be Rails controllers that, or whatever your MVC framework of choice is. There's not going to be a backend rendering the dynamic content that then is sent through Nginx. It's always going to be a JavaScript front end making API requests to a backend. So I started that very early on, which might have felt like over engineering at the time, but now I think we're well over 350 public API endpoints in FireHydrant. All of our front end uses those API endpoints, which is nice because now our front end team can actually make adjustments without a backend deployed to the application. It's had a lot of downstream effect benefits since then.
I have to ask an age-old question. Why did you pick gRPC for that transition?
It was shiny. I mean, I joke, but that was actually the case back then. And we had some really forward-thinking engineers at the last job I had, and we were using Go, and we knew that we wanted like a contract-based API system for internal and external. And gRPC, had just come out. We started playing around with it. We built tools for it, and it ended up kind of being the standard. So, it's funny, that was what we were doing at the last job, but FireHydrant doesn't use that pattern. We kind of have a raw JSON REST API backend built into our Rails application. If I were to do it again, though, I would 100% start with protocol buffer definitions out of that API and go about it that way.
Is that what you would suggest to people building a backend from scratch today? Is your advice a blanket go with gRPC, or is it something more nuanced?
I don't know if it's like Go and gRPC. I think when I say gRPC, really what I'm talking about is the protocol buffer definition and the IDL of that for the folks that don't know, interface definition language of protocol buffers. And the advantage of it is really it allows you to explain your API without implementing your API very quickly. And what I also like about it is you can have a debate with your team. You can have a pull request of just your protocol buffer definition, and your team can see that and go, that's good interface design for this API. And the other advantage of it now is, and this has existed for a while, but there's new tools out there that make this easier for generating stubs, and the code generation surrounding the protocol buffer toolchain has improved dramatically in the last 10 years. And now I kind of look at it and go, there's not really a reason not to implement it this way, because I mean, you get to explain your entire API, and then you also, for free, get an OpenAPI 3.1 file on the other side of that. And then you can use a tool like Speakeasy to then generate API documentation and stubs for many other languages in a Terraform provider. I see very little pitfalls of doing it that way.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I resonate with that so much. Like you said, a big reason of why we exist is we want to bring a lot of that native code generation experience that gRPC and protocol buffers has to the world of REST. And if I flip back a couple pages in my book, I think there would have been so many situations where, that idea of a team being able to do true design first development would have been enabled by protocol buffers. I think I tried this at a previous company with natively to an OpenAPI spec, and just the verboseness and the kind of lack of focus on design made it actually really hard, spec to work on for a design first experience. So that, a lot of people, when I ask them this, will kind of focus on the tech and the code gen and all of those pieces. But I think you brought up a really salient point around the collaboration experience that I think, especially as startup engineers, we forget, because as a company gets bigger, that's kind of probably the limiting factor for development.
Yeah, we use protocol buffers now in our systems that talk to each other. So we have a Rails application and we have a Go application. We have a planet-sized Rails monolith with like many moons of Go microservices surrounding it. And the interfaces between those applications is protocol buffers and gRPC. And we like the code generation of it. Like the protocol buffer definition only gets you so far, though it's going to give you a pretty myopic client, I should say. So like there's other things that you have to consider, such as retry policies, error handling. You have to consider, like, if you want to go further with it, like I said earlier, like a Terraform provider from these things is possible with your folks' tool, which I think is amazing. So, there's trade-offs. You just got to figure out which ones you're willing to take on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned, over 350 public endpoints for FireHydrant today. Like, you must see a lot of patterns of consumption by enterprise with your API. What's shifting in the last few years?
Oh, what is shifting? I think more and more people are willing to pull data from your API. There used to be kind of a requirement many years ago of like, you need to push data to me into my data lake. And the problem with that is, sure, we can push data all day long, but it may not be in the format you want. It may not be, enough. It may not be like frequent enough. Like you might have stale data. If we're doing like a nightly push to our customers' data lakes, like that's not fast enough in some cases. So a lot of our customers are scraping our API every 5 minutes in some cases to get their incident data. We have our most popular endpoint is our get incidents endpoint. And what our customers tell us is that they have data analyst teams, they have data analytics engineers, that their job is to write scripts that pull the data into their internal data lake from all of their vendors. And I think I don't know if it's a new trend or the new normal, I'm not quite sure, but it's definitely something I've noticed, is that enterprises are spending more time building the teams to get the data in the exact format, the exact time that they want it, as opposed to having the requirement of push the data to me.
That's super interesting. So it's like they're taking data from your API, populating some kind of data warehouse, BI system for their own work. Have you guys at all thought about like exposing the data directly in a more native way, like through a data stream or through just tables that they could materialize themselves? I'm curious if that's changed your viewpoint on actually just having a traditional REST API.
Yeah, a few things that I've considered is webhook, fire hose out of FireHydrant. Actually, that would be a really perfect name for that, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would really.
Hook up the fire hose to FireHydrant. We do webhook delivery today. Internally, our architecture is all pub sub events. So anytime you create an event in FireHydrant, such as like a note, a chat event, updating an incident, that goes to a publish subscribe model. And then if you want, you can send all of that data via a webhook. We do that today. And I think that you can go further with it. I think that you can consume from a stream, especially if you have like an internal audit logging system, can you publish events and things like that? And you kind of let your customers materialize the data the way that they want it. I'm seeing that pattern more and more. There's a company called AuthZ that does this very well with their materialized RBAC system. I think that that's actually a pretty good model for where maybe the industry is going to go with materializing and sending webhooks.
That's really interesting. Yeah, we're seeing some interesting shifts there as well. Like on one side, some people are considering opening up their, Kafka data streams directly to customers.
Yeah, that's what I had in mind. Yeah.
Yeah. I love the name Firehose for FireHydrant, by the way. I feel like now you have to launch a product.
My engineers are going to love that spur of the moment idea on a podcast that they have built.
Right. Well, drive-by development. Oh, that's super cool. To make shifts like that, something we think about a lot is like what metrics should companies actually measure for API success? Because, if you're going to go do any kind of big technical change or, anything that actually impacts the experience, you have to know what you're measuring. And I think in the public API world, there's actually quite a differing set of viewpoints on what you should look at. I'm curious if you've ever thought about like what KPI is important for the FireHydrant API.
Yeah, I mean, latency is time to first byte is one of the most important ones for us. We have a couple of pretty slow endpoints. I mean, we just represent so much data from that endpoint that we made some mistakes that we can't go back on now, which is an issue API design that you have to be considerate of. But I digress. I mean, definitely time to first byte. How long is it going to take? But when you get the request from me, how long do I have to expect until I start getting that request back? And I think that's one of the most important measurements, especially if you're using your own API on your front end. You get a little bit more leniency if this API is just for, programmatic client calls, right? Should it take several seconds? No, that's probably worse for you than it is for them if you're taking a few seconds. Well, other KPIs, I think obviously, like, do people have to retry requests to get data? That's a KPI that we measure because you can get into a situation where you have a thundering herd issue. And what are the leading indicators of, well, if you're slow and the client call times out and does an automatic retry, and you have thousands of customers that hit that just because your API tips over 3 seconds, all of a sudden your API is going to get smoked even harder. So you kind of have to set your KPIs a little bit lower down the chain. So if you have an SDK, for example, that is Ruby or Go SDK for your API, your read timeouts should be less than the API's timeouts. That way you kind of have a buffer in between, the client code. So that's one thing I definitely think people should be measuring and being conscious of. I can't honestly think of another one. I mean, like, usability of the API is really hard to programmatically measure other than going to the people using your API and asking, how's it feel? I think that we have just some very old decisions in our API. We're still on V1. Like, we have not done an API update, like, structurally in 6 years of starting. It really is the same API endpoint you got 6 years ago. It's the same one. Maybe it has more data in it, but it's the same exact structure. And maybe that's a KPI. How often do you have to change your structure?
Yeah, these are some really interesting ones. I mean that, like, so, time to first byte absolutely resonates with me. We call it internally time to first 200 or time to 200. For
I like that.
customers, yeah, I've always thought maybe we should, if we ever get into the request tracking game, we should throw up a metric in our dashboard that tells the user what the current time to 200 on the SDKs is.
I like that.
Yeah. I think another thing that's interesting is the API design problem you brought up. Like that is a really tough KPI, I think, to measure in any meaningful way. We've, a lot of customers come to us with open API specs and a variety of quality and state of kind of maturity. And today, we consume all of them. We give them, linting, warnings, and errors. But I've thought a lot about whether we should give them some kind of score, right? Something to tell them that, the design of the API today is flexible or it's not going to like block future decisions. It's a really hard thing to do because I think, industry to industry, there's also, different requirements, like the heavy requirement around pulling data from your API, like that might not exist for another API. So I think where we've gotten to is we definitely tell our customers and people we work with, like, do you have someone just thinking about the spec design as it changes over time?
Yeah. I mean, the ergonomics of an API are almost more important. I mean, when you go to the furniture store and you're trying out sofas, which one do you buy first? You buy the one that's the most comfortable. APIs are the same thing. If you have a really uncomfortable API and that's important, like people aren't going to buy that product if that's a big part of their purchasing decision. And, like, for example, if you're comparing Jira to, I think Jira has one of the worst APIs in like human history. And I can say that with confidence because we have an extremely intricate Jira integration. And the amount of like backflips that we've had to do to make very simple things work with the Jira API is astounding. We also have a linear API integration when, basically it's the same thing. Create an incident ticket in Jira, create an incident ticket in linear. The linear code and the linear API made it so that integration, we built it in a matter of days. Like it was drop dead simple because the API was so good. And I think we're going to enter into a pretty interesting reality where the companies that have very, very simple APIs, maybe not simple, but easy to integrate, like the ergonomics of it are really good. Those companies are going to see longer term success because more people are going to want to integrate with that tool. If I'm asked right now, if I had a gun to my head that said like, pick a tool to integrate with, I'm going to pick like linear right now.
Yeah.
Well, after FireHydrant, but I'm going to pick linear because they've just done like an astounding job with their documentation, with their API design. They use GraphQL. That was their choice, not mine. But it didn't matter because the client SDKs were so good.
That's really interesting. Yeah, especially in these competitive markets where, over time, the product differentiation kind of deteriorates. Like these kind of things really start to stand out for sure. Switching gears a little bit, we're just in the world of dev tools, developer platforms, a lot of paradigm shifts happening with LLMs and AI. I'm curious what your point of view on this is when it comes to the APIs that your customers use or the APIs that you guys design. Has it changed customer demand in any way, or people are asking to integrate in new ways?
I would say our approach to APIs has changed, which I think will have downstream effects. Now when I've been designing new APIs, I actually will kind of vet the design of it. And yes, this is me admitting I'm still writing code 6 years in as the CEO of FireHydrant. I've talked publicly about that though. But I kind of vet the ideas of a new API against LLMs now, honestly. They have pretty good opinions on API design, especially if you prompt it with, I need my API to be, it's a gRPC service definition. And, there should always be a verb before the request message or something like that. And you can kind of create your linting of an API, your design principles, and you can ask LLMs, what do you think about this? And you kind of have a conversation with it. And eventually, honestly, I've actually had some pretty good, at least in my opinion, internal API decisions come out of that tooling. I don't think that LLMs are going to fundamentally change how we interact with APIs, at least not in the short term. I think that they'll help us build better clients, and I think they'll help us build better APIs. But the moment we start using them, that's just going to be code calling code. I just don't think that LLMs are going to get too integrated at that point.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Then the design part, we probably see like a couple, I don't know, dozen, 100 specs a week. And
Mhm.
a lot of them we have our own tools, but I've also been kind of just copy pasting them into, those that are public specs into an LLM and just talking about it, right? Like kind of semantically trying to work through what the spec is, what the state of the
Mhm.
spec is. Yeah, it's super, super interesting just in terms of like being a guide, right? For you,
Yeah.
just the way we're seeing copilots become a guide in the IDE.
I can see like one opportunity where like a good
Mm,
API design with LLMs would play out very nicely. So agentic systems is the next probably big topic in the
yeah.
realm of AI, I think. If not, it's going to be a big part of the pie chart of discussion. And if you think about the way that these agentic systems work, you have to give them data to then keep having a conversation until it ends up in like some result, either through tool usage or some pattern. And a big part of the tool usage that these LLMs are performing, we use Anthropic and Claude, which has really, really good tool usage APIs. We basically give it like raw JSON responses
Yeah.
in some cases. And if that JSON response is bad, then it's going to have a bad result. And it's kind of making me rethink even just the key names of these JSON responses. So for example, for an incident, the resource, the URL is /incidents, right?
Mm,
But the payload is name. And if I give that to an LLM, all it gets is name. So are we going to have to start prefixing things with incident underscore name so that these LLMs actually have a little bit more context, a little bit more, data to go off of? Are we going to have to go back to the world of where everything is namespace under a key incident with an object of name description, right? Like our API doesn't do that. If we were to change that, would that make our LLM responses for either us or our customers be better? I don't know. I think we're going to have to see. But those are the types of questions I think API design is going to start driving agentic systems and, catch 22, vice versa.
yeah, totally. I mean, like on that bit about just the names, right? Like API naming is already hard enough. And I think something, without giving too much away on like an upcoming release we're planning to do in this space, when you think about tools, like if these tools are going to be used mostly by agents, does the verboseness of the name matter? If you can stick in a bunch more context by prefixing or suffixing a name, like
Mhm.
maybe you should do it. And as long as it's not a tool that's going to be used by a human, it doesn't really matter, right? Like kind of the conciseness and all of the, I think, really strong points of view people have around ergonomics today on design is kind of human led, right? It's to help a human looking at the docs or the SDK methods infer what a method is about. But that doesn't necessarily, it's not the same for an LLM, right? Maybe you do want to stick as much information in whatever, token window you have that you can give it. So yeah, no, really, really interesting. I think it also means from an API design perspective, like I wonder if we get to the place with our APIs for human integrators and APIs for agent integrators in terms of just ergonomics. Like there's probably going to be a split. The same way I think there are going to be like code bases that are fully human administered versus code bases completely driven through bots and copilots, because the quality and the verboseness of the code is those metrics change. Like you don't need to do the same thing in both of those cases.
Yeah. No, I agree with that.
Just to round this out, I'm, with all this stuff going on, like what does great developer experience still mean the same thing to you today? Like has your point of view changed on that over the last few years?
When it comes to developer experience, I think that my guiding principle is like, is it easy? Like, how far can I get before I have to read documentation? And I think that includes like great error messages. Like, if I can do something on an airplane with really crappy Wi-Fi and like be productive, that's great developer experience. As someone that flies a lot, that's when I build things, honestly, is like when I get on a plane. And that's when you really feel bad developer experience because things are slower or you don't have internet. You get an error and you're like, this is the most cryptic error I've ever seen. You go to Google it and Google takes 5 seconds to load. Like that's when it reveals itself. So, and I think it ties into, API design in the same way. Like, do I have to look up your API? If I do, like, then that's frustrating. If I'm using a Go SDK to use your API and that SDK has a method that doesn't explain the parameters, like, I'm going to be mad at you. That's really bad developer experience. So that's kind of my litmus test. How much can I build on a plane? And if it's gotten to the point now where I just know that I have to run Docker build before I get on a plane. Like, that's the habit I've had to build lately. Because the moment I get on a plane and I go into dev mode and it boots and it's like downloading layers, I'm like, I'm not building anything on this plane today.
That's a pretty good soundbite. Airplane mode is the true test of developer experience.
I think so. Yeah, I've never said it that way, but yeah, I think you just coined my term for it.
All right, I'm going to take that one away with me. On that note, thank you so much for joining us here today. This is our second ever episode of this podcast. Thoroughly enjoyed talking to you here. Yeah, I'm looking forward to chatting more in the future. If our listeners want to learn a little bit more about FireHydrant or you and the stuff you're working on, where can they go?
You can go to firehydrant.com. That's our domain. I'm Robert Ross on LinkedIn if you have any questions, or at Bobby Tables on x.com, formerly Twitter. And Bobby Tables on GitHub if you're curious if I'm full of it.
I think there's a backstory to that name, but let's save that one for next time you're on.
Yeah. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, Robert.